Welcome to this first event, CCMAR Inspires. The point is bringing people that somehow can inspire us, not only on science, but on many issues. And we have our first guest, I think you know it, that's why you're here, Alexandre Quintanilha, biophysicist and also a politician. We have also Jorge Martins. He's a CCMAR scientist. I'm Pedro Duarte. I'm a journalist, and three of us are somehow making some conversation, open also to some questions from you. We are starting by presenting our guest. Then he will make somehow a presentation talking about knowledge as the basis of democracy. Then we will do some debate. We have some questions that some people already send us. Afterwards, we will open for 2-3 questions, small questions, by the way. It's the best way for keeping this with some movement. And then in the end, we will have some food and beverage, so all of us can somehow speak. And at the end, I think there are always some questions that will be here. I'll ask Jorge, please, to present our guest. But first of all, as Jorge is preparing, I would like to acknowledge the Directorate of the University, also the Faculdade of Economy, for hosting us. The FCT, the CCMAR direction, whose support was essential from the start. And we have the pleasure to count among us Maria Faria, Vice President of Contextos, and Alberto Borges, Director of the Faro Airport. We will also thank to Decor Mont, a decoration store here in Montenegro, that supplied this vintage look that we have here on stage.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I would like to thank the organizing committee of this event. I will start by the ladies, Carmen, Isabel and Shanna, and the gang, Gerardo, Godefroy, and myself. So I think I'm not. I'm João. João, sorry, yes. Your contribution was astonishing. Okay, one of my duties today is to present Alexandre Quintanilha. And I went to my booklets and my resources to present Alexandre Quintanilha. This is from 1989. It was the first time I heard about him. And this was published by Fundação Carlos Gulbenkian. And by this time, I was a very young student in biochemistry, almost finishing the graduation. And one professor in the University of Lisbon told us, you must go to Oeiras to hear this Portuguese physicist that is coming to Porto. Okay, Alexandre Quintanilha has a very huge CV. I'll try to do this in 2 minutes. He graduated in theoretical physics and made his PhD in solid state physics in Witwatersrand University in South Africa. And he made the aggregation in biophysics in the University of Porto. By the beginning of the 70s, he was chercheur invité à Paris 11 à Orsay, and then he moved to California. He was adjunct professor of physiology in the University of California at Berkeley, and worked also in the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, also in Berkeley, where he was assistant director for some time and director for the Center for Environmental Studies. Since 1991, he came to Portugal. He was appointed full professor of biophysics in Instituto de Ciências Biomédicas Abel Salazar, and was the founder and director of the Institute of Cell Biology and Molecular Biology. He was also president of INEB, and he was also spokesperson of the Council of Associated Laboratories in Portugal. The main area of his scientific interest was physiological stress in biological systems, ranking from cells to ecosystems, but also he is very interested in science and society. He published over 150 papers. He was involved in the editorial board of diverse journals. He was editor and author in volumes in the area of stress and the environment. And in education, he was involved in many thesis committees. He organized many symposia, workshops, congress, and gave more than 3,000 talks on scientific themes for society: climate change, genetic engineering, social impact of science and technology. In the very beginning, he was awarded Grande Oficial da Ordem Militar de Santiago e Espada de Mérito Científico, Literário e Artístico in 1993. From 91 to 97, he was president of the Portuguese Biochemical Society. And in 2015, he was a head candidate from Porto Pulling district to the Portuguese Parliament for the Partido Socialista. Since then, he's in our parliament, and he gave his contribution from the political side. Thank you so much.
Now we will have Alexandre Quintanilha. As you noticed, this is in English, this presentation. CCMAR has more than 20 nationalities, so we tried somehow to do Esperanto or other language, but English was the easiest way. So, Alexandre.
Okay. Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for being here. It's a great honor to be with you, and I'm delighted to be able to discuss with you an issue which I feel is becoming more and more a challenge in today's world. I think we only have to look at the other side of the Atlantic to recognize that issues of democracy are becoming a little challenged, if not saying something else. And so I thought this would be a good topic to choose to discuss with you. The question is, how do we proceed? How do we as citizens, as researchers, as politicians, how do we proceed in a world where these things are all happening? And I don't think this is news for anybody. We know fake news are proliferating all the time, that fraud seems to permeate all domains, including research, that values are in conflict in many places of the world, that interests of stakeholders diverge, and there are more and more small groups of stakeholders that have different interests that impinge on politics, and that trust seems to be weakened continuously. What do we do? How do we proceed? And I would like to leave with you 3 recent publications from the last year and a half that I feel are very interesting in discussing this, this fear that seems to be also permeating our society, that democracy is somehow weakening in the places where it's still being used for government. There are 3 authors. I recommend these very highly because they have a very similar message in all 3 of them. And so for your reading over the Easter holidays or over the summer, please consult them. Now, to understand how knowledge can contribute to democracy, I think it's important to also ask ourselves the question of how does knowledge grow? How do we add to the knowledge that we have? And I'm going to make a very strong statement by saying that in all domains of knowledge, whether it's theoretical physics, all the way to, if you want, cooking or gardening, including engineering, medicine, including history, including many other areas, the way knowledge grows is very similar in all domains. It starts with questions. It starts with people being curious and wanting to know something about themselves or the world in which they live, or how themselves in the world they function. It then proceeds with some kind of answers, and in order to provide answers, you have to be imaginative. And in that imagination, you come up with different types of answers. If you're in biology, chemistry, physics, engineering, medicine, you call those answers hypotheses. You have Copernicus, you have Galileo, you have Darwin, you have Einstein. These are all different types of answers that you provide. In the social sciences, those answers are called narratives, and there are many. There's individualism, socialism, communism, neoliberalism, structuralism. These are attempts at answering how a society should be organized. In the humanities, you have stories and myths. The most common known myths that occur in most religions are the hero's journey, the fall, paradise. All of these are similar myths that occur in many religions. And in literature, you have many stories that are told with characters that make a difference to you. All of you in this room have read half a dozen books that have affected the way you look at yourselves and the way you look at the world around you. And it's not just books, it's films, it's art exhibitions. These things make a difference to the way in which you look at the world, the vision you have of the world and of yourself. And then the last is you try to find evidence for these answers that you've provided. And in the evidence, you try to look for coherence, you try to look for some capacity to predict some effects, and resistance to alternatives. This is the usual way in which knowledge grows. And in some areas, it's easier to make predictions than in others. If you have fewer variables, it's easier to make predictions. So you know that if you pass an electric current, you produce magnetic fields. You know if you fertilize an egg with a sperm, you also have a new body that comes up. In other areas, it's more difficult because the variables are very large. And so in sociology and psychology, it's very difficult to predict how things will grow according to the theories that are being developed. But why is it that you need the series of questions, imagination with answers, and then ways of trying to validate those answers? And the reason is very simple, is because we often discover that what seemed obvious, intuitive, what seemed self-evident is wrong. And this is one of the main lessons that we learn in the exploration of knowledge. You learn, there are many examples that I have for this, examples that you know, some you know well, others you don't know so well, that the Earth is not the center of the universe, is not obvious. In fact, it is very obvious that the moon and the sun rotate around the Earth. They do exactly the same trajectory, and only an idiot would question the fact that the moon and the sun don't rotate around the Earth. And in fact, some people were burned and some people were persecuted by saying that they don't have exactly the same trajectory. The idea of what is human nature? What do we call human nature? And you have three different answers. Hobbes thinks that people are brutes and they need to be put into place. Rousseau thinks we are very simple and very nice, and it's society who changes us. And then you have somebody like Hume who says, no, we like society, we like to be in groups, and we need to learn that way. But they are completely different notions of what human nature is. And today the big debate is whether human nature is basically the result of genetics or whether it's the result of nurture. And there's a lot of swinging around these 2 points that are here. Air is not an element, but a mixture. This is probably the most important discovery of Lavoisier, the fact that air is not an element, but is a mixture. Oxygen is poison. Humans are the result of evolution, not created. But we ask ourselves, can we accelerate evolution at some point? Is that possible? That the sum of the parts is not equal to the whole. was the basic discovery of Becquerel and Curie, because he showed that mass and energy are equivalent. And in fact, if you add the masses of all the protons and neutrons in the nucleus, you don't get the mass of the nucleus. That low exposures of many things may enhance protection, it's not obvious, and that most cells in our body are not human. Most cells in your body and in my body are not human cells. We are mainly microbes made of bacteria and fungi, and in fact, if you look at the DNA in our body, 95% of the DNA in our body is not human. They are virus, microbes of various kinds. And it's wonderful because if I was 18 years old, this would be a whole new universe that I could study, because we don't know anything about these microbes in our body. Now, the attitudes of society towards creativity, towards curiosity, have not always been the same. And I prepared this slide to show basically that until more or less the 13th century, more or less over here, before Da Vinci and Dante were born, most curious people were being punished. These are classical stories of punishment of curiosity. Prometheus was bound to a rock, and there was an eagle that came to eat part of his liver every day. Because why? Because he gave the secret of fire to humans. His sister Pandora opened the box and all the evils of the world came out. Or Icarus wanted to fly higher and he fell because the wax was melted. Orpheus looked back and his beloved was turned into salt. Adam and Eve, it's the old story. Of course, it's always her fault because she gave poor Adam the apple, and so they were both expelled from paradise, and of course, it's always her fault. And the Tower of Babel, Socrates, St. Augustine has a very interesting statement where he says that curiosity is such an evil that it is not even contained in the 7 capital pecados, sins, right? It is beyond those. It's even worse because being curious means it's not enough for you to learn what the scriptures tell you. Now, it turned out to be tolerated starting in the 13th century. Pascal has a very famous sentence saying you shouldn't be arrogant about your curiosity. You should only try to go as far as your hand can reach. Ce qui est à votre portée. No longer than that. And all of these people said it's okay to be curious, but you shouldn't be arrogant about that curiosity. Then we change in the 17th, 18th century. You have the big pushers for curiosity, imagination. These are the characters. And now, after nuclear power and genetic engineering, there are lots of philosophers saying that curiosity is a good thing, but maybe you need to be careful about what you do with the knowledge that you have. It shouldn't be everything that you want to do. You should be cautious about that. Now, what is our vision of the world? And I will make a very strong provocation here. And I will say that each one of you in this room, there are days or even parts of the day in which you feel that you are in the best possible world possible. And there are days where you feel that you are in a world that has much to be improved. And every one of us in this room is a little schizophrenic because we think often that, yes, we have democracy, we have autonomy, we have a longer lifespan than our great-grandparents. We have innovation is stimulated in all areas. Risk is worthwhile. Quem não arrisca não petisca, you know the famous statement. And then there are other days where you think that there are growing inequalities, violation of rights, less life quality, brutal competition, risk is dangerous. And this list here is no less valid than this list here. You can find very good examples of both. And so depending on how you woke up in the morning, you may feel that you are more on this side or you're more on that. And then you have an argument with somebody and you change sides in the middle of it. So this is not an unrealistic way of looking at the vision that we have of the world. And what are the factors that play a role in this vision of the world? Why do we sometimes feel we are the best possible and other times we think there is much to be improved? And amongst many factors, I want to talk about three factors. One is what I call statistical literacy or illiteracy. And at a time where everybody's selling digital literacy, this is the new aim of our government, is digital literacy is important. We forget that in many other areas, we are very illiterate. When it comes to health, when it comes to economics, when it comes to history, when it comes to many areas, most of the population around the world, not just in Portugal, are extremely illiterate. As occurs in many places. Then how do we perceive and use the new knowledge, and whether we have trust in institutions or not? Now, this is an example of illiteracy in the health area. It was, this comes from a publication a few years ago, and it has to do with doctors' estimates of the probability of breast cancer in women with one positive result on mammography. So if a woman goes for a mammography and has one positive test, this is done in England. In Portugal, of course, it's very different and much better. But in England, if you go for mammography and you get a positive test, you have here the answer of about 100 medical doctors who were asked what is the probability of that woman having breast cancer, and it goes all the way from 90% all the way to 2%. What is the correct answer in Britain? It's 8%. Okay? This is medical doctors. Okay? So the level of communication in terms of results that you get and what you pass on is very, very seriously lacking in terms of this type of literacy. Now, our view of new knowledge, and I've chosen here two ways, extreme ways, in which we look at how new knowledge is viewed. And one I call robust, and one I call fragile. And I picked 5 different areas in which you ask people, what is the evidence that you have that developments and applications of knowledge in energy, food, health, and social, and literature, what are the positive things that have come out of it? And you get this long list of things that have been success stories. There are amazing success stories in health, such as the development of sewage, very simple but important, vaccines, antibiotics, and so on. In food, breeding of different species to produce more food, insecticides, fertilizers. These are positive examples. And then you go to those people who feel that the knowledge that we've acquired have produced results that make the world possibly not such a wonderful place. And these are the examples that they will give you. When you talk about energy, they'll talk about climate change, pollution, radiation effects. If you talk about health, resistant microorganisms to different types of antibiotics, risky lifestyles, and so on. And so some of us in this room, in some areas, when we are asked to think about the contributions of knowledge to society, will list things up here, and some of us will list things down here, and some of us will list things in both sides. And I've picked 2 or 3 examples to show exactly what I mean. Talking about genetically modified organisms, I put them up there and down here. And why? Because the people who put it up there say genetically modified organisms in agriculture will solve the problems of famine in the world. It's a lie. It's a lie because the problem of famine in the world never had to do with lack of food. It had to do with distribution of food. Some people had too much, some people had too little. So it's a lie to say that this will solve the problem of hunger in the world. And these people down here will say, oh no, it's terrible because they are poisonous for your health, very dangerous for your health. They were called Frankenstein foods. These are terrible things. Modified genetics, horrible things to do. It's a lie. There's no evidence so far, and it's been in the market for quite a number of decades, that there are health effects in humans from genetically modified foods. So people will tell lies in order to defend the interests that they have, whether they be economic or whatever other reasons that they have for it. Now, trust is something that we are all familiar with. All of us have had a girlfriend or a boyfriend or several girlfriends or several wives or several husbands. And you know that trust is something that takes a very long time to build, and it takes 1 second to disappear. It's the most fragile of things that we have is trust. We lose trust from one day to the other. And the factors that affect that trust is the levels of education, information, voluntary versus imposed. People, you know, when they try to install a number of big factories in big cities in the world, near cities, they don't put it into the most prestigious areas of the cities. They put it next to the more poor areas of the cities because they feel it doesn't matter that much over there. So you don't trust them when they say there's no consequences for what those factories will be producing next to you. How are these things translated in literature? This is a list, could be a very long list, of where the world is described and humans are described in a variety of classical works that you know about. Some are utopias, others are dystopias. Let me focus on two of them. I want to talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, I don't think there's a single person in this room that has not heard of Frankenstein. But I doubt that there are more than half a dozen that have actually read the book. How many people have read this book? One. Oh, wow. That's great. Well, the book is an amazing story because it was written by an 18-year-old young woman, and the message of the book is very different from the film. The message of the book is that the creature that is produced by Dr. Frankenstein becomes violent, not because he was made of pieces of different people. Becomes violent, why? Because the doctor did not make another creature for the first one to love. Now, for an 18-year-old to understand this, to understand that it's not the way you're made, but it's the way in which you realize yourself through love, that you become violent, I think is an amazing story. And those who have not read it, it's short. There are many translations. I recommend highly that you read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The other one that I want to mention is Samuel Butler's Erewhon. And in this book, I think what's interesting is something which is actually quite actual. His claim is not a very interesting book, unfortunately. It's a little boring. But the story is a fascinating one. And his message is that disease is a crime, and crime is a disease. And if you think of the society in which you live today, this is not very far from the truth, if you think a little bit more heavily about it. And I find that fascinating. Now, we're getting to the end, and I have another 2 or 3 slides to show. In politics, policies are determined by essentially 3 factors. Current and accumulated knowledge, what we know today, our view of the world, and you've seen that it varies a great deal, and our trust in institutions. And requires a great deal of dialogue across many domains of knowledge. Why? Because it's very easy to illustrate. If you look at the discussions on climate change today, they have implications when it comes to what kind of energy you use, but they also have impact on agriculture and fisheries. They have implications on food supplies and water pollution. They have huge health impacts. This means that growing inequalities are occurring all the time, and that conflicts and migrations are also the consequence of it. Now, this is a world. You don't just deal with it by knowing one area and not discussing with the other people what the possible results might be of changing something. So you need dialogue. And That doesn't even happen between departments in the same university. So how do you expect it to work in society if you don't teach that to occur in most universities? We collaborate more easily with people from another university than from people from another department in the same university. Now, when conflicting interests arrive, and we have a large list of them, climate change, vaccines, GMOs, big data, biodiversity enhancement, researchers will say, it's simple, very simple. Researcher will claim that those who doubt just don't know the facts. They're just ignorant. And so what you need to do is you give them more data and you will convince them. Very naive, because that's not true at all. You don't just give more data and expect everybody to swallow it like it was the truth with a capital T. People pressured to change their beliefs tend to seek out evidence that supports their worldview and ignore, devalue, or challenge facts that don't. People, that's us. No, it's not people, it's us. You, us. That's what we do. This is exactly what we do. So don't think that you just add more facts and you will convince people. It doesn't work that way. Many examples. I have here a long list which we can discuss afterwards. These are all examples where you can give people as much data as you want until you're blue in the face and you won't change the view that they have about these applications. It just won't happen. That's just not the case. And we could discuss some of these. Big data is an interesting one. I have 1 minute to finish. So you remember when the whole discussion about Cambridge Analytica came out, because they asked 80 million people to give access to their Facebook, and they were able to put an algorithm into place where if they knew that somebody had about 120 likes, they could predict the choices of that person better than a coworker. If they had 300 likes, they could predict it better than their own partner. And I say that if they had 1,000 likes, they could predict it better than the proper person, what they would choose, because they would know them better in that sense. And it's a little frightening in that context. Take home message, and I've made it 30 minutes, which is, I've chosen these 2 sentences. The first one, because I think it should be written at the entrance of every educational institution in the world. It's a wonderful quote. I think it's one of the most inspiring quotes that I know, and that is, the whole purpose of education is to turn mirrors into windows. I think this is aesthetically very beautiful. I think it's true with a little t, not with a big T. I don't believe in truth with a big T. I think it's something which we should carry with us for the rest of our lives. And the second one is by a philosopher. He was a journalist, English journalist, who moved to Chicago. He's a philosopher who died recently, and he said, take care of freedom and truth will take care of itself. And what he meant is freedom to be curious, that is to ask questions, freedom to be imaginative, to think of answers, to be audacious in testing those answers, and don't forget to listen to those who have something that they can teach you in the process of developing knowledge and transforming that knowledge into policies. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. We will. Hello. Now we have some questions, as I already told you, that people already sent us, and we chose some of them, and I think in 20 minutes you will be able to do your own if you want. I think the presentation perhaps makes us.
I prefer to stand. That's all right.
Okay. But one of the things that we talked about here was knowledge and also some policy, because you are a politician, and being also what it says, the knowledge is the basis of democracy. But all of this comes because you also are a scientist, and I think there is two things that I would like to ask you. I already know the answer because we talked about it, but I think it's interesting. It's why do you become a physicist? And during the time that you were in college, you made a choice by somehow changing the course, and you made 3 lectures different from your area. And my question is, so why did you become a physicist, and why did you?
Okay, I was a bad student in high school. I passed with 10, 9.5, 10.5 in 20, until I reached what is now called in Portugal 9th grade, quinto ano do liceu. And at that moment, we had a new teacher that came in. I grew up in Mozambique. And instead of teaching us biology by talking about cherry trees and peach trees and apple trees, which I'd never seen in my life, they don't exist in Mozambique, he decided to take us to visit some mangrove swamps and some coral reefs. And suddenly the world opened up. Mangrove swamps have little fish which have both gills and pulmões. Lungs, sorry, my English is. And these little fish come out of the water, and they will go onto a little trunk, and they will sit there and with big eyes, and they will watch you as you walk by. And they'll sit there for about 10, 15 minutes, and then they'll go into the water, and then they'll come out a little bit. And I was completely blown away by these little animals that came out. And they had little crabs with different sizes of claws, beautifully colored. The coral reefs were amazing. And suddenly I started to study. And in the first trimester, I got a 14. No, I got a 10, as usual. And then the second trimester, I got 14, and my parents were a little astonished. I'd never had a 14 in my life. And in the last trimester, I got a 19. And my father went to see if there was an extra 1 that I put in there, because it was so unusual in the process. And so I started to study, and my favorite of all disciplines was descriptive geometry. I love descriptive geometry. And we had a physics teacher who was a little crazy. He was very knowledgeable, but he was totally spacey. You'd fall off the thing. He would write equations on top of each other, but physics in the 20th century was the most exciting subject that was growing at the time: relativity, quantum theory. And so when I finished, I decided to do something between physics, maths, and descriptive geometry. I chose civil engineering. And then in the second year, I walked into the room in university, and there were 100 students, and there was not a single woman in the whole room. And so I decided I was in the wrong place. So I went to physics and mathematics, which had only 14 students, half of which were women, half were men. They were all from different nationalities. It was a wonderful experience. So choosing physics was because it was my worst subject, but it was the most fascinating area, and because I needed diversity of people around me. Then I met, when I was finishing my PhD, Sidney Brenner, who some of you know. He got a Nobel Prize about 10 years ago, but this was long before he had a Nobel Prize. He came to the university in Johannesburg to get an honorary degree, and I was a young student, and I was made to be a chaperone, to take him around and do whatever he wanted, not whatever, but what he needed. And he was a wonderful person. He was tiny, he was about this size, had lots of hair coming out of his ears, and his eyebrows and his nose. But he had these beautiful blue eyes, you know, they were sort of shiny. And I said to him, you know, I've just finished physics. Biology seems to be getting very interesting. And I'm not sure I should change because I have to start all over again. And he looked at me with those little blue eyes and he said, well, if that's what you want, do it. And I thought about it and I did it. And so I bought a one-way ticket. I didn't have enough money to buy two ways. I bought a one-way ticket to Berkeley. And I spent the next 20 years there learning how to kill rats and make mitochondria and prepare chloroplasts. And then later on, I decided that energy and environment was a very, I'm talking about, you know, today energy and environment is very fashionable. 40 years ago, it was not fashionable. But I was fascinated by the work of a man called Charles Keeling, who was the one who started measuring the CO2 levels in the atmosphere in Hawaii. And I invited him to come and talk in Berkeley, and we decided to start a new center. And then just life goes on. I spent a third of my life in Africa, a third in America, a third in Europe. I don't know where the next third will be.
But what do you think, or what would you qualify as your best scientific achievement?
It's not the most quoted paper. I have papers that are highly quoted. They are not my favorite areas. I think one of the areas that I was very fascinated by was why physical exercise is bad for you. And this is very counterintuitive. And the reason is very simple. Actually, the reason is quite intuitive. When you do a lot of exercise, you consume a lot of oxygen. Oxygen oxidizes, okay? Oxygen makes butter go rancid, makes wine go bad, makes these little spots in your skin that you accumulate. Oxygen is a strong oxidant. It oxidizes things. And so when you do a lot of exercise, you're doing a lot of oxidation. Now, when you're young, you may adapt and develop better defense mechanisms and repair mechanisms. And that happens. But when somebody at the age of 65 who's never exercised goes and buys fashionable clothes to jog with all these apparatus, you know, measuring their temperature and measuring their heartbeats and measuring everything they can measure, I'm afraid that I'm not sure it's very good for them. And we showed that in rats. I didn't show it in people. We didn't do experiments on people, but in rats, that's what you show. If you do it when you're young, you adapt and you're able to deal with it. If you do it when you're old, forget about it. It may make you feel good. People say when I finish exercise, I feel great, you know, because all these endorphins are happening in the body. But people say that cocaine does the same thing. Makes you feel great. So it's, you know, up to you to choose what you. So that's one paper that I enjoyed doing.
Alexandre, scientific misconduct is a growing issue for science.
Which?
Scientific misconduct.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? And probably it's undermining the confidence of society in scientists. Are we risking to lose confidence in scientists?
That's a very tricky question. I think fraud is not a new thing. People forget that Mendel, who was the beginner of genetics in the world, he was a very respected head of a convent, of a monastery in Brno, in the Czech Republic. Mendel, when the results were not what he wanted, he would change them. Okay? This is Mendel. Okay? Mendel, when some experiments he did worked very well, and they proved what he wanted to do, and some didn't. And when they didn't, he would just, this is not a good result. Okay? Newton change the data of his experiments. So Freud is not they were intelligent enough to know that it didn't matter, okay? That this theory was still correct. But it's not a new thing. I think today fraud occurs because competition is so brutal, which is what I wrote there. Mm-hmm. Competition is so brutal that people will not even discuss what they're doing for fear that somebody would steal their ideas. There are a lot of scientists I know that don't discuss the work that they're doing in conferences because they're afraid that somebody with better resources will then do the work much quicker and will publish it. I had a postdoc, a doctoral student, who went to New York to do a postdoc, and she came back after 3 months because she was horrified by what was happening. In her lab, she was working with one of the most prestigious scientists in her area in New York, and he was an evaluator for NIH proposals. Now, those in biology know these are very prestigious institutions. And he was an evaluator. He was somebody who was reading the proposals. And one day, he came into the lab with somebody else's proposal and said to his students, you have to do all these experiments in the next 2 months so that we can publish. Somebody else's idea. She was so horrified that she dropped and she came back to Portugal. She didn't want to work with this person. Now, this is not the rule, obviously. Please don't believe that this is what happens all the time. But competition is so fierce that people sometimes don't have enough time to redo their experiments, to test them. They find something very exciting, and it's so exciting they want to publish right away to get prestige, and they didn't do the careful work of checking what happens. And so you get this is not deliberate fraud, it's lack of care. Mm-hmm. There are people who do deliberate fraud, and that's dangerous. And every time something like this happens, of course, the general public looks at this and say, you're supposed to be our heroes. You know, you're moving the frontiers of knowledge further and further. How can we trust the results if these things happen? So yes, I think the answer to your question is fraud has increased the suspicion that people have, and also allows for people to say, your view is just as good as my view. And we know that that's not always the case. In most cases, it's not always the case, but it weakens trust in institutions and in people.
Well, I think it's important to talk about knowledge and somehow changing all, also to politics. And where did you think that you most influenced the society? As a researcher, or now as a politician, using somehow the same knowledge or new knowledge?
It's very different. As a politician, you defend. One of the things you learn that I learned in Parliament is that you need to. It's important to be able to achieve compromises. And because not everything you want to do will be possible to do immediately. So you need to say, okay, I believe that this needs to be done, but the way you get there has different views from different political parties. You won't have anybody in Parliament who will say they don't think that education and knowledge is important. Nobody will tell you this, I hope. I don't think anybody will tell you this. But how do you help? I believe that this turning mirrors into windows is the main function of education and culture. How do you provide the instruments and the environment for people to become more courageous in terms of testing different ways of going about the world? How do you make people self-confident enough without being arrogant? How do you help people become self-confident so that they can then search for the boundaries of knowledge and move forward? And I think different political parties have different ways of doing this. You know, when we talk about social justice, another concept, who doesn't believe in social? Well, some people don't believe in social. But if you think of social justice, how do you achieve this when you have such a diversity of backgrounds of people, you know, kids that work, that live in very precarious environments, and people that have all the help they can get and go to the best universities and travel around? How do you equilibrate this? So politics has helped me to understand that people they really believe in different ways of making a society better. I happen to believe in a certain way, which I think is more in terms of being able to discriminate as little as possible and giving people as many opportunities as you can give them. Other people will feel, no, we are wasting money with those that will not achieve things. I think that's wrong, but that's my values. And I think as a politician, you learn to defend your views, and I do that. I don't have many opportunities, but every time I can, I will defend my views. In science, so I think it's important to do that, but I don't work alone. I worked in a community of people that have different views. And I think that's I've learned a lot from listening to other people's views. In research, it's probably not very different. When you have an idea, you would like, I think the most important thing that we get when we have an idea is somebody who can criticize your idea very robustly. Because if your idea is able to withstand that, then you can be more confident that it's a good idea. Mm-hmm. You test what Popper said about how does it face controversy? How does it face people that are criticizing that idea? And I don't think it's very different in politics. So I've spent more time doing research than politics, so I probably contributed more in research than in politics. But I'm confident that I can contribute a little bit in discussions, about genetically modified organisms, discussions about things like assisted reproduction. I don't know if you remember, 40 years ago, when the first children were born by medically assisted reproduction, everybody was saying, do you want to be known as the first test tube baby? Do you want to have a label up here that says test tube baby? Now, so a lot of people were against medically assisted reproduction. There's still many people against medically assisted reproduction. Many people around the world. Now there are millions of children that were born by medically assisted reproduction. Many families that are very happy that they could have children that way. So everything I can do to defend the idea of medically assisted reproduction, I will do it. The same with medically assisted death. All those things are things that I believe strongly in. And so, both in politics and in science.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's check if we have some questions in the audience to see if anyone wants to do it.
Right here.
I will ask you please to present yourself and
And a very short question.
Or at least in a very short time.
Canario. So I'm going to start on this last point. Difference between science and politics. I think science is much easier. You need imagination and all those things that you said, and you can test those ideas. You cannot hear me. Okay, I'll turn this way. You should be able to listen to me sometimes. Okay, so as I say, science is easier because you can test your ideas, and of course you try not to make mistakes, but you can make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
In politics, I think you have to be much more careful. You can kind of test, probabilities maybe, but you're dealing with people and all those sentiments you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I think it's more challenging, more uncertainty and so on. But there is a crucial aspect, is the trust. I think the trust is the main asset, I would say.
Adelino, I agree. Let me add that as you move from disciplines of knowledge where you can isolate the number of variables as much as possible, the easier it is to test predictions. If you have very few variables, you can, and I gave the example of physics because it's true. If nobody today doubts that an electric current produces magnetic fields, because if you pass a current, you get a magnetic field. If you move into areas where there are more variables, if you go into sociology, or you go into psychology, or you go into many areas, including politics, the number of variables increases significantly. And so, because with humans, you cannot go around doing experiments in the same way that you can do with butterflies or with little rats or whatever. It's much more difficult to make predictions. So if somebody believes strongly that a certain political vision they believe strongly that this is going to produce a better society, it takes much longer to prove that this is going to prove, or to provide, not prove, to provide evidence that this gives a better society. And in many cases, we have examples of where people believed very strongly that this was a better way, and they were wrong. And so this, of course, increases the level of mistrust of people that are very, on the other hand, if we don't live by certain passions where we put all our energy into, whether it's in the areas with fewer variables or areas with more variables, I think we also feel frustrated in the process. What I've learned in 74 years is that I always have something in the back of my mind that says, don't be so confident. Be a little humble about what you think it really means. And today, in biology, this is increasingly important, because the whole discussion of whether we are nature or whether we are nurture enters into every discussion about education, about the way you choose, you choose who you marry, choose what kind of, now that you can actually select genetic, there was in San Francisco about 30 years ago, they had talking about medically assisted reproduction. There was a bank of sperm, but only from Nobel laureates. And it went into bankruptcy, which I think is a wonderful example of wishful thinking that didn't work out. But there is now a bank of oocytes from great women athletes. It hasn't gone into bankruptcy yet, but it's not doing very well. But this idea that you can produce humans by selecting the genes, or that you can produce humans exclusively by education, whatever it is something that is a long discussion. This has been discussing for many, many centuries. And you have to understand that both of these things play with each other. And in fact, they play at the genetic level. Epigenetics shows that the genes can also be altered in certain ways. So, yes, I agree with you. With more variables, it becomes, you ought to be a little more careful about how you push for things. But in politics, you know, if you don't push for something, somebody else will. So it's a way of, you know, defending your vision of the world. I want to come back to this idea of the way we look at the world, and I'm convinced that in this room, every one of you has a vision of the world that you would like to exist, a vision of the world that sometimes was on that right column, sometimes on the left one, and it changes with age, it changes with relationships we have, it changes from country. I couldn't go and live in the United States today. With a man with orange hair, I couldn't. And many of my friends, not many, but a few of my friends are moving out of the United States because they don't want their children to grow up in that environment. They fortunately are able to move. Some people are not able to move, and they are stuck with the man with the orange hair. So these politics is, you have to be careful, but if you're too careful, you don't do anything. And so you have to also do and then see what happens. You know, you do an experiment. And most people vote for that. Vote for either more of an experiment or less of an experiment. But I'm always very, let's put it this way, I'm always very, I have a great deal of discomfort when people in politics say, I never have any doubts and I'm never wrong. And we have a few of those.
Yeah.
Yes.
We have a few of those. And so I think that with that caveat, I think people ought to try and do things.
Awesome. We have another question.
Thank you, Aureliano Alves, bioquímico. It was an excellent talk. But can I assume that what the take-home message from us is the title, meaning knowledge as the basic democracy?
Yeah, I think.
Because some of us were born without democracy, but our students,
Yes.
they're born in democracy.
Yes.
And they don't maybe understand how strong it is.
Yes.
And maybe also because they don't read any more books and to learn, and we can use knowledge for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I say so?
I think you cannot have a democracy without knowledge. Let me put it in the negative. I think that you can destroy a democracy even if you have knowledge. The most frightening example was Germany in the beginning of last century, that had probably the highest level in all areas, in music, in literature, in physics, in biology, and they democratically elected Hitler. Okay? So I think knowledge is not enough to prevent democracy from eroding, but I don't think you can have democracy without knowledge. And I think we ought to be, when I was talking about, you know, I made a crack at now everybody talks about the importance of digital literacy. This is the new goal for Portugal, digital literacy. And I think it's a wonderful goal. But I think that if digital literacy is not able to help in many other kinds of literacy, then I'm not so sure I'm so much for it. If we cannot mitigate health literacy, historical literacy, economic literacy, all of these which we have very low levels of, I think as an instrument, digital literacy will not be as important as it should be. I think digital literacy as an instrument should be used to increase literacy of our society as much as possible, and to get rid of fake news, and and get rid of, or at least talk about fraud that is happening. So yes, I think knowledge, and I also, the last thing I put there would take care of freedom, and the truth will take care of itself. I also like, because both freedom and truth are not with capital letters. They are constructions. They are continuously being increased, if you want, or enhanced in the process. I'm very afraid of truth with the capital T. We have too many examples in the world of people who want to dish out truth with a capital T, and I'm very afraid of those people. Now, those of us who are scientists will say, well, don't you believe in some of the results of science? Of course I do. So there are certain things that we have been able to demonstrate that clearly look like they are the truth. But you cannot guarantee that in 20 years there will be another discovery that will question what you just discovered. And that's great. I think that's wonderful. So it's hard. I know it's hard for some people to grow without having certainties. It's hard. I'd love to be able to be completely certain about things. But I think as you live and you get to my age, you recognize that certainties you have to take with a grain of salt. You have to be a little cautious about it, especially if you want to convince others. For yourself, it's okay. But if you want to dish it out to others, I think that's much more problematic.
We have the last one, I think.
Oh, okay.
Hello, my name is Joana Lessa. I'm a designer and a professor of design here in the university. I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It's always a pleasure to hear you. I have a question, a little bit of a provocation. I think it follows up on the first one, or the last one. As a scientist and also as a politician, do you think that today's democracy is a good environment to produce knowledge?
Do I think that?
That today's democracy, the state of democracy, is a good environment to produce knowledge? Thank you.
I've never thought about that. Let me try two answers. The first one is that I don't know of any other system that is better to allow people to search for knowledge. And I mean search for knowledge as a process. So I don't know of any other system, political system, which encourages and helps people not to be afraid to question what is quote unquote sacred. So yes, I think democracy is a place that should be the place which encourages people to ask questions and to think of answers. That's my first answer. where do I see a caveat? When democracies, this is going to sound strange, but when democracies stop being a democracy, when I like to go back to the idea of Hitler being elected democratically, we have to be careful with that statement, because he wasn't, there was a very small number of people who elected, and that's another problem. Most people don't play an active role in politics these days, which I think is a pity, because they think that in the States where I lived a long time, people think that the Democrats and the Republicans are exactly the same thing, and it doesn't make any difference. It's not true. So when the political system is determined by a small number of people, it can easily stop being a democracy, as you see sometimes. And so that's an even greater responsibility on you to play a role in the development of a democracy. And I find that as democracies get established, somehow, unless a crisis comes up, most people are too lazy to exert their voting rights. And I find that rather disappointing. In other words, you need a crisis to wake up people and say, your vote is important. And maybe politicians aren't doing enough to show the difference between different views. But I don't think that's true. I believe that, the reason I accepted to go into politics, when I was invited to go into politics, I started laughing. I said, you must be kidding. I have no experience in politics. I'm a virgin, very few areas, but I'm a virgin in politics. Why are you inviting me? And they said, well, exactly because of that. Because you may come with a different view of it. You may be a breath of fresh air. I'm not sure that I was, but I think that I accepted because I was very frustrated with what was happening to Portugal at the time. That was the reason I accepted. I wanted to change. I wanted to help to change. And I was not happy. I felt that it was, for me, it was not the right direction. And so that's why I decided to enter into politics. But I can't think of any other system that would encourage the growth of it. Oh, today's demand. Well, those books are very good to answer your question. The book by David Runciman has a very interesting answer. He says that democracy, do you have a copy of that statement that I sent you? I'm not sure. No, oh, okay. Let me read this to you because I think it's very, very interesting. David Runciman, can somebody borrow me the glasses?
They are... No,
No, I can read it.
Okay.
He says, this was a book published in 2018, the problem for 21st century democracy, which is what you're asking, is that its positive virtues are coming apart. Simply staving off disaster is not enough. For democracy to flourish, it needs to retain its ability to combine net benefits with personal recognition. This is a statement. And then he says, that's not happening anymore. There are still benefits and there is still recognition. They just don't go together. Solutions to shared problems, which depend more and more on technical expertise, are moving one way towards technocracy. In other words, we don't feel we are competent enough to make decisions about how to solve things, we give to technocrats to do the answer. So that's one way it's moving. Demands for recognition, which are increasingly expressed in the language of personal identity, are moving the other way, towards something close to anarchism. So what he's saying, in other words, more succinctly, is that there are two problems. Problems are so complicated that most of us don't know how to solve them. So we delegate on techno people to delegate. So they will find the answer, whether it's in food, in health, in economics, in environment. They know the answer, and we will just follow them because they know the answer. And we don't have an opinion. We cannot have an opinion because we don't know enough. So that's one way democracy is moving. The other is that we are creating so many small groups. When you think about identity, you know, there's ethnic identity, there's professional identity, there's sexual identity. There's all kinds of different groups. In each area of knowledge, you get 20 different groups that form, and they all want to be funded so that their problems get solved yesterday. A democracy cannot function that way. There's too much of a splittering of identity movements coming up. And I think he has a point. So I recommend you read the book, How Democracy Ends.
Our last question.
One last question.
Dr. Wood, where's the other mic?
We as Europeans are more or less proud of our democracies, at least in Central Europe. And you corroborated my opinion to look, when you look over the other side of the big ocean, we don't have very good examples. But nobody, or almost nobody, looks at our own house. I'll give you an example. One of the most important positions in Europe is the European Council. Do you agree with the way that that woman has been elected? We had a very strong debate in Europe, in Germany, in England, etc., between two candidates defending different opinions about Europe. And suddenly, a kind of deus ex machina, we have Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen directing Europe. Okay. Your party was there, listed, not only yours. All Portuguese parties who are in parliament defended and voted for this lady. Yeah. Is this a good way of building up trust in politicians?
Very, very, very good question. Well, I didn't say democracy was perfect. I didn't say that. Churchill said that it was not perfect. There are ways in which systems get put together, and I don't think there was anything illegal about the way she was selected. According to the rules, she was selected according to the rules by the different countries and the different governments that put together. Now, that was the way in which she was selected. The political parties representing the various countries decided that she was the person that they would provide a position with to be the chairman of the council. Now, there are many ways in which you can do elections. You can, if you followed the American elections, you're probably a little surprised by the way in which somebody who didn't get the majority of the votes got elected. This is a 1-hour-long lecture explaining how the American system works. And it's a very, America founded the first democracy in the world, other than the Greeks. But the Greeks were not really a democracy because women didn't count and slaves were everywhere, so that wasn't really a democracy. So the system is not, as I said, the systems are not perfect. But if a system is put into place, and if something not disastrous occurs, and I'm not sure that this is not going to happen in the US, because I suspect Mr. Trump will be reelected, I suspect. I think putting Trump reelected is much worse than having Mrs. von der Leyen as the chair of the council. Yes.
Well, thank you for your questions. We are almost ending. I have here one last question about, and we talk here about the students and also the young people. And present times is demonstrating that the strength of the youth voice. And do you think that young leaders will become somehow part of the democratic system in the near future? And will they know how to use knowledge in the right way?
I'm not very good at making prophecies. Prophecies is not my strength. I'm very happy that young people, well, actually, I don't, this business of young and old, it's kind of a discriminating way of looking at it. I know a lot of people my age that are much younger than people that I know that are 20 years old. So it's not something easy to make the distinction. Also, I'd love to live in a world that is post these labels, with old and young and black and white and believer or not believer, post-gender world where people don't have, labels across them. But I think any group of people who feel strongly about something that they feel is important for the future of our planet and our world, I think is a very positive experience. And I think it's important that they get heard. And fortunately, I think they are getting heard. Some people are accusing them of being a little hysteric. You only have to go to any parliament to see how hysteric some parliamentarians become. It's not something which is exclusive of young people. I know some university professors who are full professors that can become hysteric occasionally in the Senate discussions, and so that gives it a little color.
Well, we are at the ending of this session. As I told you, we will have some not welcome drink, goodbye drink afterwards. But we will have 2 moments. One, just summing up. I think one of your words, 3 words. I think it were inspiring. That's what we are seeking here, and I hope that we can keep the curiosity that you said. To have the best imagination to produce the necessary evidence, of course, on the produce of knowledge. And I will ask you for a quote, an inspiring quote to end this session.
Well, I cannot think of a better quote than the one I gave you of Harris. I think that when he says the main purpose of education is to turn mirrors into windows, is such a powerful and aesthetically pleasing idea. A mirror reflects you, so it's sort of narcissistic. You're looking in a mirror, and of course you're beautiful, you're wonderful, you're great, all these things. And then suddenly, the mirror disappears and you start seeing other things that are equally as wonderful or more wonderful than when you were looking at the mirror. And I find that if education, unfortunately, that's not what education is doing. Mm-hmm. In many cases, that is not what education is doing. And I'm sorry to say that, but if we keep that as a goal, I think I see myself in that quote. This was done by a journalist who was English, moved to Chicago, and wrote this in the middle of last century, and I think it's a wonderful quote. There's another one by Einstein, which is that if you cannot explain something simply, you don't understand it good enough. And I like that also very much. If you cannot explain anything in a simple way that everybody understands, you know, when you go to conferences sometimes, you get the feeling that many people try to make it as obscure as possible in order to show their eloquence. They like to use big words that other people don't understand, you know, and so they like to show that they are so great because half of the people don't know what they're talking about. And so everybody, you know, reveres and thinks, you know, you're such a great person. I don't have any idea of what you're talking about. So it must be great. Now, I like that quote of Einstein because I think that if you cannot explain something in a simple manner, it just means you didn't get it. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It is a great pleasure. I'm very honored and I'm very touched by the fact that you wanted me to start the series. And I hope my followers will be even better and will keep the boat going. Thank you very much.